Thanks for being here, and thanks Abba for the invitation to present my work today. So I hope sharing is okay. Seems fine. So my name is Laure Guérit. I'm a geomorphologist. I'm working in Rennes in France, and today we'll talk about grain size, fractures, and erosion rates in rivers. So as a broad introduction, so my work is focused on this big question: how do continental sedimentary systems respond, transmit, and record climatic and tectonic perturbations? So for me, a continental system is a catchment area affected by uplift and, let's say, climate, where sediments are produced by erosion. The sediments will be transported mostly by rivers towards sedimentary basins, which can be continental or marine. And because sediment production and transport is controlled by climate and tectonic, sediment archives can be used to unravel the climatic and tectonic history of a landscape, but this requires us to understand first, how do landscape respond to climatic and tectonic perturbations? And second, how are these responses transmitted and then recorded by the sediment? So I look at this question from both sides. So on one hand, I work on the dynamic of erosion in catchment area on sediment transport to understand how these processes induce storage, so sediment storage. And on the other hand, I work on the storage, so the sediment archives, and try to understand what they can tell us on the processes of erosion and transport. So today is no exception, and my talk is divided into two parts. So first, I will talk about the rates and modes of erosion in bedrock rivers. And in the second part, I will talk about the grain size signal, what can we do with it and how. So first, erosion in rivers. So I'd like to stress here that most of the following is the work of Marion Fournereau that she did during her master internship. I think Marion is with us today. And she's now doing a PhD with us. So erosion in active landscapes is often described following the stream power law, which states in its simplest form that the topographic evolution through time, so dH over dt, is equal to the uplift rate U minus the erodibility K times the drainage area A to some power times the slope S to another power. This term K, so the erodibility, is not that well understood, and it stands for everything that modulates erosion. So we can think, for example, about climate and climate variability. We can think about the vegetation cover. A very important aspect for erosion and erodibility is the lithology of the rock that is being eroded, together with the size and the mass of the sediment in transport. This has been nicely illustrated by Sklar and Dietrich some years ago with an experimental approach. So here on the top is a schematic view of their setup. So they put a disk of rock at the bottom of a tube. They put sediments and water on the disk, and the propeller here moves the water into the sediment, and this induces erosion of the disk. Below is one of their main figure. It shows let's say the erosion rate of the disk according to the mass of sediment they put on the disk. And here at the bottom, you can see a view from above to have an idea of what the mass of sediment means in terms of sediment cover. And so they did this kind of experiment for different lithology, and they always obtained this very nice curve, which illustrates what we now call the two-lane cover effect, which is basically if there is too few or too many sediments, there is no erosion, almost no erosion, because you have nothing to erode, or so many sediments that the bed is no longer visible. And there is, let's say, an optimal mass of sediment for erosion to occur. Another important parameter for erosion and erodibility seems to be the density of fracture in a bedrock. So when I say fracture, I think of, I mean any mechanical discontinuity in a rock. So fracture, joint, bedding, whatever create a discontinuity. So this figure is from a quite known paper by Monareta in 2007. And they show, so it was a drilling study, and they observed that when there are a lot of fracture, drilling is faster than when there are few. So if you have, let's say, a rock that is quite competent, it's harder to drill than when there are many fractures. The impact of fracture has also been studied quite a lot on hill slopes. So for example, in this study by Neely et al., they characterize the density of fractures in different catchments in the San Gabriel Mountains in the US. And they show that the more fractured bedrock here on the left erode faster than the other one, which is less fractured, despite being less steep. So there is a clear impact of the density of fracture on erosion rate. If we focus on rivers, we know that it will also influence the morphology of the channel and the mechanism of erosion. So when there is no fracture, channels tend to be narrow and dominated by abrasion. On the contrary, when there are fractures, like on this example here, channels tend to be wider and dominated by plucking. And we know that plucking favors high erosion rates. So that's the fact that there are some fracture in the bedrock should influence our stream power law and the erodibility. So we decided to perform Sklar and Dietrich-like experiment to explore the role of fracture on erosion rate in bedrock rivers. So to do this, we use a 3D printer. This is a small video here to print a network in 3D. So we use thermoplastic that becomes soft when in contact with water. Once the network is printed, we pour concrete on it. This is the middle picture here, and we let it dry for a few days. On this example, so all the network we use are made up of two families of fractures. On this example here, the families are orthogonal, they are vertical, and they are spaced by 20 millimeters. But we explore various geometry by changing the orientation of the fractures, their spacing, and also their dip, so the vertical orientation. And we also perform a few experiments without any fractures. When the discs are dry, we add some gravel on it. So we use gravels that are 1 to 2 centimeters in diameter, and then we use a setup similar to Sklar and Dietrich to induce erosion. To record the topographic evolution of the experiment, we use a system of 4 cameras to acquire pictures with different angles so that we can reconstruct the topography by structure from motion. So this is a small video of the experiment. So here is a disc. At the back here, you can see some grains. This is a propeller. And you will see that when there is erosion, when the grains are moving, it is not possible to see the surface of the disc. So this is now, we cannot see through the water and through the sediment. So to perform the experiment, we erode the disc for 2 minutes, then we stop the experiment, we empty the tube, we take the pictures, we fill the tube again with water and sediment, and we erode again. So each experiment lasts about 1 hour of effective erosion, but it is in total, let's say 3 to 4 hours of work in the lab minimum. So on the left, this is one example of the topography we can obtain with a structure from motion in our setup. So the color code is for elevation, and here in the middle, it's the screw that we use to attach the disc to the tube. In the other figures that I show, it has been removed. Because we have temporal series of topography, we can calculate difference of topography through time and obtain erosion map, as you can see here in the middle. So this time the color code is for erosion. So erosion between two topography. In yellow, it means a lot of erosion. Blue is limited erosion. And in gray, it's areas that did not erode significantly between the two topographies. And in our setup, not significant mean less than 0.2 millimeters. So from this map, we can do two different things. First, we can sum all of this erosion and obtain average erosion rate through time. But we can also work on the signals that we observe here, because these yellow patches there mean that we have a plucking event. So here, it's a block that has been removed at once. So based on the intensity, we can automatically identify plucking, so here or there, from abrasion, which is the dark blue. So we can automatically classify all the map of erosion and obtain this kind of data with plucking, abrasion, or not significant. With this in mind, let's look at some results. So I show here two typical experiments, so the topographic evolution of two typical experiments. At the top, it was an experiment with a squared network. The network was spaced by 40 millimeters, and you can more or less see it on the topography, but on average, erosion is quite symmetrical, so it's a radial symmetry. The topography is quite smooth, and you can see that erosion is mostly located on the edges of the disk. This is typical of abrasion-dominated experiments. At the bottom, the network was forming diamonds, and you can observe that this time erosion is not at all symmetrical because we have removal of block almost anywhere on the disk, so we have plucking. And also we have way more erosion in this experiment than in this one. And this is typical of a plucking dominated experiment. So already from the topography, we can identify the processes. Let's now look at erosion rates. So I show here the cumulative erosion for 4 different experiments through time. So in purple here, it's an experiment without any fractures. The other are different geometry. And you can see that as soon as we have fracture, the erosion rate is higher. So here we see a clear impact of the fracture on the erosion rate. But it's a bit difficult to look at at the result from this kind of figure because we perform more than, I think, 40 experiments by now. So instead of looking at this curve, I propose to look at the one on the left, right, sorry. So here I focus on some experiments. So on the top, I focus on the experiment in which we vary the dip, so the vertical orientation of the fractures. So I show you the average erosion rate. So this is the slope of this curve here with respect to the dip. So here I simply take the dip of the two families and I sum it. And you can clearly see that the more vertical the fracture, the higher the erosion rate. And this increase is, let's say, a factor 4. So we clearly document the impact of the vertical orientation of the fracture with respect to the flow. At the bottom here, I've focused on the experiment with various spacing. So again, it's the average erosion rate, and this time with respect to the average spacing of the fractures, because we use a squared network, but we also printed some rectangles. So it's the average of the two. And we observe this very nice curve, which suggests that there is an optimal spacing for plucking for erosion to occur. And I will go back to this idea in a couple of slides. So this was the erosion rate, and if we merge erosion and processes, so we know we have experiments dominated by abrasion that are associated with low erosion rate. And we observe that all of these experiments are associated with only a few numbers of fractures. So I cannot show all of that, but please believe me, all these experiments have only a few fractures. On the other side, we have experiments with plucking. Plucking is always quite intense as we have rate of more than 2 millimeters at once. I did not mention it, but the discs are 2 centimeters thick. So it's about 10% of the thickness that is removed at once. And these experiments are the one with a moderate number of fractures. And what is very interesting is that we observe a third type of experiment. These experiments have intermediate between these two. So in this experiment, it's the experiment with a dense network. In this case, we do observe some plucking, as you can see with this dark blue spot here, but the thickness of this plucking is limited. It's often 1 millimeter up to 2 at the maximum. And the plucking is located on the edges, as you can see on this picture. So very similar to what we have in abrasion. So we do have plucking, but in terms of rate and in terms of localization of erosion, they do behave as if they were in abrasion. So to go further, let's say to try to formalize this observation, I need to define 2 additional parameters. The first one is the contribution of plucking to total erosion. So based on the map, plucking, abrasion, not significant, I showed you before, we simply calculate how much erosion is made by abrasion and how much by plucking at each time step. So this is for the whole experiment, and then we simply take the average of it. So this is a contribution of plucking to total erosion. The other parameter is the number of blocks per disk. So here we simply count how many blocks there are in a disk, and we use it as a proxy for fracture density, because if you only have a few fractures, you only have a few blocks. And this is how these 2 numbers relate. So you have here the contribution of plucking with respect to the number of blocks for various experiments. And please remember that plucking is always associated with high erosion rate. So I could change here this axis for average erosion rate, and we would have more or less for quite a similar curve. And so what we observe is this sharp increase in plucking contribution until about 50 blocks, and then this clear decrease. And this is how we explain it. So at the bottom here, we have experiment dominated by abrasion. And as I said, these experiments are the one with only a few fractures, so that the size of the blocks is always larger than the size of the sediment we use. So we think that in that case, plucking cannot occur, there is only abrasion and erosion is limited. At the top here, we find experiments dominated by plucking, with intermediate number of fracture, and in this case, the size of the blocks scales with the size of the sediment. So we have a ratio of about 1, and this clearly favors plucking and thus high erosion rate. On the right here, we have the mixed experiment with a dense network, so that the size of the block is smaller than the size of the sediment. So there is some plucking, but it behaves as if it was in abrasion. So this is where we are today. We think that the ratio between the spacing of the fracture or the size of the block and the size of the sediment strongly influence the mode of erosions, whether it's abrasion or plucking that dominate, and thus the intensity of erosion. So to support this idea, we perform one additional experiment with a dense network, but we use smaller grains so that this ratio is different, and it is close to 1. So I show here the cumulative erosion through time for this experiment. So in blue, it's the one performed with the grains that are 1 to 2 centimeters in size. In red, it's with the smaller grain, and we do observe more erosion and also more plucking. So grain size seems indeed to play a role, but so far we only have one experiment, so it remains to be further investigated. And this will be part of the PhD of Marion, who just started a few months ago. And in addition to this lab work, Marion will study a natural system. And we selected the Hérault River in the south of France as a natural case study. So the Hérault River is a very nice bedrock river, as you can see on this picture. Here it is flowing on carbonates, and we can see a lot of beddings. We also have regional faults. And along the rivers, there are plenty of evidences for plucking. So here on the top picture, you see the very sharp angles here are evidences of, let's say, recent, we don't have time, but recent plucking events. And we also have a lot of abrasion, as you can see on this picture, with a smooth area here. So we went there last May, and we acquired some topographic data with terrestrial LiDAR, as you can see on this picture. We also did some photogrammetry, and our idea is to identify areas dominated by plucking from areas dominated by abrasion based on maybe the roughness of the rock. So here, for example, here is an area dominated by abrasion, and here we think it's a recent event of plucking. And you can see that there is a clear signal in terms of roughness. We're also working on the sharpness, let's say, of the rock, because abrasion is smooth and plucking is characterized by this sharp angle. So we can also see it in the normal orientation of the rock. And we are also doing some grain size measurement to see this idea of ratio between fractures and grain size. And to do this, we are doing manual measurement, or we use a 3D algorithm that we recently developed in the team. So I don't have any result to show on this part today because this is brand new, but I think this is a nice transition towards the second part of my talk, as I will now focus on grain sizes. So grain size, what can we do and how? I must admit I'm a bit fond of grain size because I think it's a very cool data to work with because you manage to work in a very nice area such as rivers, or sometimes you can go on the coast. And also the data is very simple. You just need a tape and a rock to measure. So there is no proxy or no further analysis in the lab. But most importantly, I like grain size because they record information about the processes of erosion and transport. In fact, the size of a grain is sensitive to climate, tectonics, and to lithology. So for example, here Marshall and Sklar look at the, and these three parameters are key components of landscape dynamics, I have shown in the very first slide of my talk. So Marshall et al. Look at the size available in soils in catchment affected by different precipitation rates, and they observe that dry catchments have coarser grains than fine grains. Grain size is also sensitive to tectonics. So here, for example, in this study by Whitaker et al., we follow the grain size according to the distance along a river, and this river crosses a fault here. And you can see that close to the fault, the grain size clearly increases. Lithology also play a role, of course, and for example, a sandstone tends to produce smaller grain than gneiss, for example. So once they are produced, the grain will be transported, and we often observe that the size of the sediments will evolve during transport. And we often observe along rivers or along alluvial fans, as illustrated here, that the grain size decreases with distance. So this is the black dots that you can see here. On average, grains are smaller and smaller. So based on this observation, a model has been proposed to explain this kind of trend. So I simplify it here a little bit, but the idea is that these models are based on the initial grain size, the space for accommodation, and on fluxes. So with this parameter, we can explain this kind of trend. And the idea is to use this to, let's say, explain grain size trend through time in terms of this parameter, which relate to this one. So this is a bit fast, but this is a general idea of working with grain size distribution and grain size trend, is to have an idea of this parameter to go back to this first thing. But if you have ever been to a braided river on an alluvial fan, you may have noticed that it is not that simple to work with grain size. First, because grain size can vary quite a lot in a river, from a very fine grain to boulders that are a meter in size. And also we have a lot of grain size sorting on the, well, we can see a lot of sorting on the surface of rivers. So if you want to sample grain size to do one of the studies I just showed, you need to deal with the spatial heterogeneities, and also you need to decide how you will sample the grain. So the rest of the talk is focused on these two questions. So here, so first, dealing with grain size sorting in riverbeds. Here is a picture of the Urumqi River in China. This is a river I like a lot. This is a braided river that mostly transports gravel. So this picture was taken during the wet season. So we have water in these channels, but the river is dry during, let's say, winter. So if we go there during winter, we can see, we can look at the morphology of the channel. And we will observe something like this. So in this channel, we will find three, let's say, structures. The real name is morphosedimentary elements. So where there is flow constriction, the flow accelerates, and there is some local erosion, and this is where you will find what is called a chute. Where the flow expands, the flow decelerates a bit, there is a bit of deposition, and this is where you will find bars and avalanches. So these elements are defined from their morphology, but you can also observe that there is some grain size sorting. And we wanted to know whether or not this sorting is significant, so between these elements, and also when we work at the scale of the whole river. So to answer this question, my colleague went there and they measured by hand the grain size distribution of a dozen of bars, dozen of avalanche, and a dozen of chutes. And on the right here, this is what we obtained. So this is a cumulative density function of the grain size distribution, whatever the unit, it doesn't really matter. What matters is that in blue and green, you have the bars and the avalanches, and you can see that the two are completely merged. But the chutes here in yellow are always coarser than the two others. So to go a little bit further than this observation, we performed some statistical analysis. So based on ANOVA test, for the one who are familiar with it. And we show that indeed the chutes are significantly coarser than the bars and avalanches. So although we do have three morphosedimentary elements at the surface of this river, we only have two significant grain size distribution that are related to the processes of local processes of erosion and transport and deposition at the meter scale. So there is some sorting, but it is not, but let's say in practice, it is quite limited as there is only two families. So I already think this is nice. It is not that messy, but quite often we do not really look for this kind of details, but we rather want to have an idea of the grain size distribution of the whole riverbed. So does this sorting that we can see still matter at this scale? To answer this question, we were a bit influenced by the work done by the group of Peter Ashmore in Canada. So they have this big flume that I really like. It is about 15 meters long and a few meters wide, and in these flumes they simulate braided rivers with grain size distribution. Looking at these rivers, they define what they call the morphological active layer, which is, to be a bit simple, the layer that is active during transport and where the grain that is constantly we work during sediment transport. So in this experiment, this layer is about 4 centimeters thick, and in the Urumqi River, we observe that it is about 1 meter thick, or deep, if you prefer. So in addition to this topographic evolution, they also can record the grain size of the experiment. So here is the view from above. Black is a coarse grain, white is a fine grain, and we can observe this very nice grain size sorting, so at the surface of the riverbed. And these patterns are very, very similar to what we can observe on a natural river. Because we're in a flume, in an experiment, they were able to look at the grain size distribution at different levels within the active layer. So to have a view from inside of the grain size distribution. And this is what this figure shows here. So we have 10 layers within the active layer, and you can see that most of them have exactly the same grain size distribution, except maybe for the top ones that are a little bit coarser. But on average, in these experiments, the grain size is homogeneous at the scale of the active layer, so at the scale of the riverbed. Despite this very clear small-scale small-scale grain size sorting. So do we have the same in this natural river? To answer this question, we go back to the Urumqi River and we dug a big trench across the riverbed. So you can see it here. The trench is about 7 meters long, and we excavated sediment as 30 samples that are 1.2 meter times 1.2 and 20 centimeter thick, deep. So we have 30 samples, and in addition, we measure by Wallman counts the grain size distribution that was available on the wall of the trench. Well, and this is what we observe. So here, each line, black line, is the grain size distribution of one of these 30 samples from the trench. And in green, it's the grain size distribution of the wall. And you can see that there is some scatter, but all the distribution looks quite similar, and they match with the vertical counts. So it means that in this trench, all of these samples have the same grain size distribution, implying that there seems to be no sorting in this trench. To go a little bit further, we merge the sample according to their layers, so from the top layer 1 to the bottom. And this is what we observe. The 5 layers have exactly the same grain size distribution, and again, it matches with the vertical distribution. And finally, we merge the samples according to their lateral position to see if there is any lateral trend. And here again, we observe that all the distribution are exactly the same. So at a small scale, we do observe sorting according to the transport mode, but as soon as we go over this scale, so here it's above, let's say, 1 meter, there is no vertical sorting, there is no lateral sorting, meaning that the grain size distribution is homogeneous at the scale of the active layer. And this is, I think, a pretty good news for paleohydrology and for sedimentology in general, because most of the time we do not have access to the riverbed, we only have access to cross-section in conglomerate like this one. But thanks to what we observed to the Urumqi River, which is an unarmored predate river, we can say that in this kind of context, these deposits are representative of the road riverbed, and we can use them to say things about the paleo rivers that deposited this sediment. So grain size sorting is not really an issue. It's more a question of scale, of choosing the good scale depending on your question. So we are left with a second complexity when we work with grain size, which is how to measure the size. So maybe I should have said before, a grain is characterized by 3 diameters. So the largest diameter is the A-axis, the intermediate is a B, and the smallest one is a C. And in most of what I showed before, I was talking about the B-axis. And when I only show one side is the medium B-axis of a population of grain. Sorry, I should have said before. So classic methods to measure grain size are based on the manual measurement of a given number of grains. So the very famous one is called the Wallman method, and it consists in measuring grains at regular interval along the tape, as you can see here. An alternative, as I have already shown, is to dig a hole to sieve the sediment, and then you weight the sieves, and you obtain a grain size distribution. So I think you can guess from this picture that these methods are very time-consuming, they are physically demanding, and most of the time you can only sample a few square meters, which can be totally fine, but sometimes it is not because you want to work on a large area or you want, I don't know, it really depends on your question, but sometimes this is not, the representativity is too limited. So to overcome these issues, method based on pictures have been developed. So here the idea is to take a picture of your grain and then to segment each individual grains and to get the diameter of the grains. This method is way easier to implement, but it suffers from the 2D vision of the 3D object, so that if your grains are not flat on the riverbed, you may underestimate their diameter. So in the recent years, a method based on the use of 3D data have been developed. So 3D data can be obtained by camera, by LiDAR, by drone. And most of the time, the roughness is derived from the topography. And with some field calibration, roughness is associated to a class of size or to a grain size directly. So this method is able to cover large areas, but there is a clear loss of information because we use a proxy and most often only one medium size instead of a whole of a full distribution. So to overcome all of this limitation, we developed with a colleague in REN an algorithm of grain size segmentation from 3D point clouds that is fast, easy to implement, and that give access to the grain size distribution together with the shape and the geometry of a population of grains. So the paper has just been accepted to ESF, I think it was two days ago. And so our motivation was really to work directly on the 3D point cloud to extract the grain size distribution. So we call it J3 point for granulometry from 3D point clouds. How does it work? Well, first of all, you need a point cloud. So on the field, you can acquire it by with a structure for motion approach. So the idea is to take a large number of pictures of your area of interest with some scales, and then you can use a software to reconstruct the topography from the pictures. You can also use a LiDAR, as shown on this picture, to scan your area of interest. And in both cases, you need to clean your point clouds so that you only have the grains that you're interested in. So there is no classification in J3 points, so you really have to give it only the grains. And once you got these cleaned point clouds, the idea is to segment each grains and then to fit each grains. So the initial segmentation is performed with a watershed algorithm that routes all the points toward local maxima. So each point of the point cloud is associated to a local submit. So this first step is very efficient, but it tends to over-segment grains. You have one example here. Here is only one grain, but we have 1, 2, 3, 4, let's say, watersheds. So the second step of the algorithm is to correct segmentation by merging grain. So we merge the grain according to various criteria. The first one is that submits have to be close, subgrains, let's say, have to be a neighbor, and we also look at the angle between the subsets. If the angle is very low, we say it should be merged. If it's very sharp, we think it can be the transition between two grains. So we use this kind of criteria to merge, and then we can also clean the segmentation. So again, based on angles, we can also remove grains that are too small. So for example, if a grain is only 5 points, it might not be a grain, so we just remove it. And if it is too flat or too elongated, again, it might not be a grain, so we remove it. When the segmentation is done and clean and you are happy with it, then you can fit all the grain with an ellipsoid. And from this ellipsoid, well, you can get any geometrical information on your sediments. So you can, of course, get the 3 axes of the grain, but you can also have the orientation, you can have some idea of the shape, and so on. So this is how the algorithm works. And to test and validate it, we went on the field. And I showed here just one example, but we did several of them there in the paper. So we went to the Cap Frel in Brittany. So this is a very nice location with beautiful people here. And so with my colleagues, we sample the people. So first, we perform a Wallman counts. So you can see the tape here. And we measure a little more than 500 grains, so by hand. And then we put targets for structure for motion, and we took picture and cover an area of about 10 square meters. Back to the lab, this is a point cloud we obtain, and this is a segmentation with a J3 point and the feed by ellipsoid. So here it is a little bit messy, but when you run it on your own computer, you can of course zoom into the point clouds and check that everything is okay. So from this ellipsoid, we are able to get a grain size distribution that we compare to the one we obtain on the field with Wallman counts. That is considered as a ground truth. And this is what we obtain. So again, this is the grain size, cumulative density function of the grain size distribution. In, let's say, dark color, it's the Wallman count, so the field measurements, and in dash lighter color, it's distribution from J3 point. And you can see that the curve clearly overlaps. So the envelopes are for uncertainties. So this figure might be a little bit messy. So another way to look at it is to use quantile diagram. This is this graph here. So here this idea is instead of looking at the whole distribution, we select a few key points. So for example, the 10th quantile, the 20th quantile, and so on. And we plot this quantile for the distribution obtained with J3 point with respect to the distribution obtained with the Wallman count for each axis. And in all cases, all the dots fall on a 1-1 line, as you can see here, which means, again, that the two distributions are similar. Well, that the two methods lead to very similar results. So in other words, our algorithm is able to recover the same grain size distribution as we sampled by hand. So this approach that we develop is non-destructive. It can cover large area in a manageable amount of time, and there is no need for calibration. The algorithm worked without any control. Although we do recommend to, if you have time, to measure some grain just to check that everything is okay. Very important, the point clouds should contain only grains because there is no classification, and grains should be described by at least a few dozen of points because otherwise it's very difficult to capture the ellipsoidal shape of the grain. Scenes should be a few square meters for reasonable calculation time. If your sample is larger, then we recommend to split it or to use another computer, but this is really up to you. It does work for any size. It's more a problem of computer capacity. What is really interesting with this new approach is that we have access to a large number of grains so that distribution are more representative. We have very easy access to the 3 diameter of a grain, but also to additional parameters that are very, very difficult to measure on the field, such as the azimuth, the dip, idea of the volume, or whatever. So this is my last slide, just to wrap up a little bit what I show. So predicting erosion and landscape dynamic can be is challenging because there are multiple parameters involved. I hope I have convinced you that the density of fracture in bedrocks together with the size of the sediment in transport exerts a strong control on the modes of erosion, so abrasion versus plucking, and thus on the rate of erosion in bedrock rivers. I have shown that grain size can be a little bit messy, but there is some organization in it. And I think the possibility to, the easy access to 3D data really opens an avenue for grain size study because we can access large data sets, so with more representativity, and we can characterize the 3D geometry of grain, and this really opens new perspective. And with this, well, I thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Laure. Thank you so much. It was really interesting. It's a very extraordinary work, I would say. Both parts that you are presenting. So the chat is now open for questions, and I think we have already a question over there from Ian Reed, who said, very interesting abrasion plugging experiments. I'd welcome knowing if you control for concrete composition, hardness, strain in all cases. And 2, if you use a fresh sample of mobile grave each time. And finally, 3rd, did you control for shape, roundness of each batch of mobile gravel?
Okay, so I'm sorry, I lost my sharing. Oops. Sorry. So I will share again. I'm sorry. I'm just confused. I don't know what happened. Do you see my screen? No?
Yes. No.
Okay. Yeah, here it is. I'm sorry for that. Okay. So for the first question, do you control concrete composition? I'm really sorry. I'm messing something with the sharing. I don't know what I'm doing. So yeah, concrete composition. So we always use the same mix for the concrete. But for the moment, we do not we do not measure, characterize the rheology per se. So this is a project now that Marion is a PhD student, because the master internship is quite short in France, so we could not do it. But this is something we plan to do. What I can say is that we always use exactly the same mix. We wait for about the same amount of days. And we did some replicates to check that we did obtain the same erosion rates. So I hope in the, let's say, future, in the few months, maybe year, we will have a real control on that. For the gravels, so at the beginning, they are quite angular, as you can see on this picture, and they get more and more rounded with time, so we change them regularly. So during an experiment, we checked because that there is no mass loss. So if there is, we add a bit of grain, but usually it's really like one grain that we have to put in addition during an experiment. And we change them, I cannot say, but we change them regularly so that they stay angular. And do we control? Well, we have a large box of gravels that come from a hardware store. So they have been calibrated by the, I mean, by the store. So we do not check every time because we trust the guy who makes them. So I hope this answers your questions.
Thank you. So I think we have another question from Mike, who says, do you think that all grain sizes are moving at the same speed? Or is there any selective transportation, leaving the coarse grains progressively behind and therefore gradually falling downstream? What do you think?
I guess you're talking about the field, about natural rivers. So in the experiment, the grains are more or less the same size, so we assume they move the same way. In the field, this is I would say there is a lot of research on that. Why do we have downstream fining? So grains are finer and finer, partly due to abrasion, because during transport grains shake each other. So this remove particles, particle can break. So we have fining due to this, and we also have we also have deposition. Coarse grain are deposited first, and we are left with a finer grain. But this is really a whole topic of research, and it's difficult to answer this in 1 minute. I hope I answer your question.
Okay, so in the meantime, if nobody, okay, I see there already is a question. It was quick. So this one is by Jingtang Qin. I hope I'm saying it correctly. Thanks you for your talk. And he has 2 questions. One is, how does the gradient of riverbed itself would affect the accuracy of the point cloud method if we want to have a river reach mapping? And the second question is, it is so surprising to see that the active layer is as thick as 1 meter for natural alluvial river forming. What method could we use to define the active layer? How large do you expect the discharge could sustain such a thick layer?
Okay, so first question about the gradient and point clouds. So to run the algorithm, we recommend to have an horizontal point cloud. So you should correct for any local slope. So if you acquire your point cloud by photogrammetry, I would say it's not really, well, even with LIDAR, actually, it's not really an issue. I mean, you have to have a point cloud that is dense enough to capture your grains, but the fact that you have a slope is not really an issue. But indeed, for the algorithm to run, let's say, in a very efficient way, we do recommend to correct for this. I think there is an option in the algorithm to do it. And if you are really working on a very large data set, very large areas, I say you should split your sample, otherwise the calculation times can really get super long, so you do not want it. So you can really correct locally for the slope. About the alluvial river, so I was a bit fast on it. So this active layer is a layer that is active during transport. It does not mean that the whole layer is moving at each second or at each minute, but that during the hydraulic season, this is a layer that is involved in sediment transport. So it scales with this morphosedimentary elements that I show. So the anabranches tend to be lower than the bars, for example. And if you look at the difference of topography between these morphosedimentary elements, at the scale of the river, we observe that it's in the range of 1 meter. In the experiment, so they record the topography from above, and this is really the high and the lows that they can see during an experiment. But this is really during an experiment, not at one time step. About the discharge, so I don't have the number. In the paper that we published on this river, there is a hydrograph, so the discharge is in it. But because I'm messing with the screen share, I do not want to open the paper. I'm sorry for that, but I can send it to you if you want afterwards. But it's a classic river. It's not a huge river. It's a normal braided river. So nothing super specific. 1 meter is not that thick. Actually, the sediments were up to, let's say, 10 centimeter in diameter, so it's not that huge.
Okay, I think that answers the question. Thanks, Laura. So there's another question by Alexander. He says, great talk. I'm curious, why might the diamond fracture patterns increase the plucking efficiency? Also, is it possible to print natural fracture pattern analogs with characteristic distributions of orientations and spacings? Very cool.
Thanks. So diamond patterns, we think that because you have this angular shape, especially the ones that are very, I never know how to see the one that with a very small angle. I think it is quite fragile, so that when you have impact, this is an area that will break quite easily, at least more easily than the square you can see on this figure here. So we think that this diamond shape is really easier to remove. And I did not show it, but once one block is gone, it is easier to remove a block just nearby. So we do observe spatial trends in plucking. So one block is removed, and then you have a block just next to this one. So next in the with respect to the rotation of the propeller, of course. And we do observe this in-chain event of plucking. So I think this is why plucking is so efficient and leads to very high erosion rate. So the problem is that diamond shapes are more difficult to build in the lab. So we were not able to run a lot of them. This is something we expect to do during the PhD. So about your question, print natural patterns and so on. Yes, this is something we would like to do, but it is not that easy to do in the lab because we have to print this. So this network, for example, was already almost a day of printing, and quite often we have to do it again because we always have issue with 3D printers. So it takes a lot of time, and then you have to pour concrete in it. And this again is not that easy. So when the fractures are vertical, it's sort of okay, but as soon as we have some inclination, it's more difficult because it's not completely liquid, because if there is too much water, then the network will dissolve from the beginning. Because as I said, this material becomes soft when in contact with water. So if we put really too much water, then the network does not hold very well. And so natural spacing, you may have any orientation, so you have to print it, and maybe you have something that is closed, so we cannot put concrete in it. So for now, we just use geometrical network, and maybe in the future we will change a bit the setup and go towards more natural network. But yeah, this is something we would like to do. It would be really, really nice.
Okay, so we have another question from Ilanan, who says, thanks for the great talk. Did you compare your grain size measurement method to other methods that were recently developed? For example, the grain net from Lang?
Yeah, so again, I went a bit fast on it for the sake of time and of the format, but yeah, so we did not compare per se to other methods, that we did not use our point cloud and apply other methods. But we do look at what other methods are able to perform. So I think the interest of our method is the fact that we work on 3D. But maybe there are other methods that are more efficient to segment but do not offer the grain size fitting. We're also able to work on very small and very large grain, which is not that common. So GrainNet, I'm not familiar with it, so I don't know exactly how it works, but I'm happy to discuss about it. But yeah, I think the real addition of our approach is the fact that it's small point clouds that are very easy to you can really go on your field on the field and acquire your own point cloud and then run everything on your computer. But in the paper we discuss in more detail the pros and cons of each method. So.
Okay, so I think there are no more questions. I might ask a quick question. I also have a question about the active layer, and that is, do you expect there to be a lot of change in when you think about different rivers? So if you have a different grain size distribution or maybe different river morphology, things like that, do you expect it to be maybe bigger or smaller?
Yeah, so it is based on what the group of Peter Ashmore done and what we observe on the Urumqi River. So it should scale with this morphosedimentary element, so with a little topographic variation of your riverbed, and it seems to scale with grain size of your river. So I think, but again, this is in the paper, I'm sorry if the number is wrong, but I think it scales with like 10 times the D90 of your grain size distribution. Maybe it's not 10, maybe just 5, but this is the idea. You have a scaling with the coarser, with the coarser part of your grain size fractions, which makes sense because what the river is able to transport, I mean, is an information about the transport capacity of your river. So yeah, you have some clues when you look at your river or what it might be.
Thank you. Thank you for the great talk. It was really, really interesting.
Okay, any other last question? No? Okay, I think we are done. Probably Laure is already a little bit tired of replying so many questions. It was a great talk. Thank you so much for accepting the invitation. And
You're welcome.
for sharing your work with us. And thanks also to everyone that attended today, and I hope to see you next week. So that's it. Thank you so much. See you.
Thanks everyone for being here and listening.